G'day frothers, it's Will here from Flow Mountain Bike, and this next to me here is the all-new Polygon Mt Bromo. Now, it might come as a bit of a surprise, but this is actually Polygon's first proper full suspension e-mountain bike. Far from being the e-Siskiyou that we expected, the Mt Bromo is a big and burly enduro-style e-MTB with a totally new, if somewhat head-scratching suspension design. So how does that suspension work? What's this bike like to ride on the trail, and how does it compare to the competition? We've been testing the Polygon Mt Bromo for the past couple of weeks to find out. Now, before we go any further, make sure you hit that subscribe button if you haven't done so already to make sure you don't miss out on all the new video reviews we have coming your way in the near future. Also, the full review of this bike is now live over at flowmountainbike.com. We put a link in the video description below. If you click that, that will take you through to the full review of this bike here, which has a ton more detail of our experience of testing this bike. If you've got any questions for us about the Polygon Mt Bromo, chances are they'll already be answered in the full review, so make sure you click that link and check it out. We'll start by giving a bit of an overview of the Mt Bromo. Now, this bike features 29-inch wheels and it's got 160mm travel front and rear. It's designed for a similar type of riding as the Trek Rail, the Specialized Levo, the Merida E160, the Norco Sight VLT, and the Canyon Spectral On. It's built around a burly, if somewhat agricultural looking alloy frame, and it features a Shimano motor and battery. Interestingly, Polygon has chosen the smaller 504 watt-hour battery for the Mt Bromo. That, along with the fact that this frame won't fit a water bottle, may make it a non-starter for some riders who are looking for maximum range out of their e-mountain bike. Still, if you can move past that, the smaller battery is nearly a kilo lighter than the 630 watt-hour battery option from Shimano, and it's also considerably cheaper too, which helps to drive down the total price of this bike. Now, of course, where things get really interesting is the Mt Bromo's rear suspension design. This is called IFS, which stands for Independent Floating Suspension, and it's a 6-bar platform. Not many brands use a 6-bar platform, though you've probably heard of the Specialized Enduro and the Demo, and of course Atherton Racing does use a DW6 suspension design for its carbon and titanium full suspension bikes. If you're looking at it though and wondering how the heck does it all work back there, you're not alone. Firstly though, it helps to visually separate the chainstays from the seat stays. The chainstays, which form the primary swing arm, have the axle at one end and two small links at the front. These links rotate as the suspension goes through its travel, and they control the rear axle wheel path and things like anti-squat and anti-rise. Meanwhile, the seat stays drive the rear shock with a small rocker link, and they control the leverage ratio. And it's this separation of axle path from leverage ratio which Polygon claims to be the key advantage of the IFS platform. It also allows Polygon to use elevated chainstays, and that means the rear wheel can be tucked in right up close against the bottom bracket. The result is a 435mm rear center length. Now that is super short for a 160mm travel 29er, let alone one with a motor and a 2.6-inch rear tire. It's certainly the shortest that we know of. Only the Canyon Spectral On has the same 435mm rear center length, but of course that bike does it with a smaller 27.5-inch rear wheel. Now, while the rear end of this bike is short, the front end is anything but. Polygon has built the Mt Bromo with a slack 64.5-degree head angle and a reduced offset fork. Reach measurements are huge as well. On the medium I've been testing here, it's got a 470mm reach. The seat tube angle is fashionably steep at 77 degrees, and the bottom bracket hangs quite low. There's a 35mm BB drop between the hub axle lines. For 2021, there will be 2 Mt Bromo models coming to Australia. Both of those bikes will be built around the same alloy frame and that 504 watt-hour battery. And being Polygon, of course, the pricing is very sharp. The entry-level model is the Mt Bromo N7, and that bike will sell for 5,799 Australian dollars. And then there's this bike here, the Mt Bromo N8. This bike has a sticker price of 7,899 Australian dollars. For your money, you're getting a Shimano EP8 motor, a Fox 38 Performance fork, and a Float X2 Performance Elite shock. We've got Shimano Dior XT 1x12 drivetrain, 4-piston brakes with 203mm rotors front and rear, and there are Schwalbe Magic Mary 2.6-inch tyres, which come with the super gravity casings and Addix soft rubber compound. All up, it's a really impressive spec list that ticks off a load of boxes off the e-MTB wish list. It's not exactly the lightest bike though. Confirmed weight for our medium-sized test bike here, weighed without pedals and set up tubeless, is 24.38 kilos. Now at 175 centimeters tall, I've been testing the medium size in the Mt Bromo. Despite that huge 470mm reach, the effective top tube length is kind of short, and that's because you've got that steep seat angle and a very short 35mm long stem. With the saddle at full height, there's definitely more of a forward weight bias on this bike, and that does place a little bit more pressure on your hands when you're riding on flatter terrain. The steep seat angle does provide a very comfortable climbing position though, and it centers you nicely in the middle of the bike. As for suspension setup, there is a handy little pressure guide on the back of the fork legs. For my 68 kilo riding weight, I set up the fork with 84 PSI, which worked well, though I did speed up the rebound damping about 3 clicks faster than the recommended setting. The Fox 38 has already proven to be a fantastic fork and a great match for a burly long travel e-mountain bike like the Mt Bromo. This was my first experience with the performance version of this fork, which uses the cheaper grip damper. Now, while it does deliver fantastic small bump sensitivity, when you're riding really fast and rowdy terrain, it doesn't have quite as much control as the more expensive and more adjustable Grip 2 damper. With that in mind, I would recommend that more aggressive and heavier riders consider adding volume spacers into the air spring to beef up the mid-stroke and keep the fork riding up a little higher in its travel. As for the rear shock, Polygon recommends setting up the Float X2 with 30% sag. There's no other specific recommendations for the 4-way adjustable damper though, which is a bit of a shame because there's a ton of tunability to this rear shock, and that also means there's plenty of scope to get it wrong. I started out with Fox's recommended damper settings based on the 170 PSI I had inside the rear shock, though I did find the suspension to feel a little sticky and also a little bit harsh because the rear shock wasn't recovering quickly enough on high-speed chop. I ended up backing off the high-speed rebound and compression damping until they were 1 click off the lighter setting. I also ran the low-speed rebound and compression damping around 4 to 5 clicks off the lighter settings. With those changes, there was an immediate improvement to suspension performance with a much livelier feel to the back end. More importantly though, the faster rebound setting allowed the rear shock to recover properly, resulting in better reactivity and more suppleness on the trail. Now, given that not every rider is going to be across all of the adjustments on that rear shock, I'd love to see Polygon develop some more specific setup advice for Mt Bromo owners. Once set up to my liking, the suspension on this bike does perform really well. It doesn't feel radically different to a well-tuned 4-bar design, and I wouldn't say it's quite as buttery or as well controlled as the suspension on the latest Specialized Levo, but it is still very supple and floaty on rough terrain. There's also no question that it's more reactive than an equivalent single pivot platform like that found on the Merida E160, for example. In comparison, the Mt Bromo is less jerky at the pedals, and it's also more neutral under braking and pedaling inputs. That active suspension feel is complemented well by the sticky high volume tyres, which helps the Mt Bromo to deliver outstanding traction. These Schwalbe tyres feature the new super gravity casings, which does mean they're quite heavy. These weighed in at around 1,350 grams each. And with the soft rubber compound and the aggressive tread pattern, they're certainly not the fastest rolling tyre around, but geez, do they grip like there's no tomorrow. Because of the tough casings and that big high volume 2.6-inch width, you do want to run these tyres at lower pressures. I ended up with just 16 PSI in the front and 19 PSI in the rear. Even at those lower pressures, and despite not running any rim protection, I haven't put a single puncture into either tyre. I did manage to ding the rear rim pretty badly, but even still, the tyre came away unscathed, which is really impressive. With all of that traction combined with the raked out front end, the beefy Fox 38 and the powerful 4-piston brakes, the Mt Bromo certainly delivers a load of confidence up front on the descents. It also builds speed really quickly thanks to the hefty overall mass, those big 29-inch wheels and high volume tyres, and was something I noticed coming off the back of testing a bunch of mullet bikes lately. In comparison, the Mt Bromo rolls along the rough stuff more easily with less chance of the rear wheel getting caught up. Along with the rear suspension's ability to gobble up square edge hits, this bike is very good at maintaining momentum on really rough and rowdy trails. Of course, with the bigger rear wheel, I did find my arse made contact with the rear tyre a couple of times when riding really steep descents. You soon learn to adjust your riding position accordingly, but it is something to consider for shorter riders who may be tossing up between a full 29er and a mullet setup. Where the Mt Bromo really surprised me though is just how nimble it is for such a big and heavy e-MTB. The short rear end prevents it from feeling like too much of a barge and allows you to steer off the rear wheel and change direction more easily. It's not quite as willing to dive into corners compared to a mullet setup, and certainly compared to a bike like the Canyon Spectral On, which has a sharper geometry and a 51mm fork offset, the Mt Bromo doesn't initiate turns quite as easily. You do need to work a bit more at the bars to crank it over into the turns, but once you commit to this bike and get over the front end, it's actually quite an engaging bike to ride through twisty single track. It also helps on the ups too, where you can kind of pivot off the rear wheel and swing the whole bike around, rather than having to push the whole bike as wide as possible. I will say that it isn't as planted as comparable 29ers with longer back ends, like the Norco Sight VLT 29, for example. The chainstays on that bike are over 20mm longer than the Mt Bromo, and that gives it a very stable ride quality both on steep climbs and on high speed descents. That'll be even more noticeable for taller riders who may actually want a longer rear centre to match the longer front centre on the bigger frame sizes. The flip side though is that the Mt Bromo is for sure the more naturally agile bike out of the two. It certainly feels right at home sessioning purpose-built jump trails where the compact rear end and the traction-rich suspension and tyre combo means you can really rip through berms, boost jumps and practice your manuals and cutties in between. Now, while we've mostly been impressed with our Mt Bromo test bike, it hasn't all been plain sailing. Unfortunately, the rear shock blew a seal at the damper bleed port and that saw it lose all damping entirely, which wasn't ideal. The following day, the fork then developed a leak at one of the wiper seals. Now, of course, both of those issues would be covered under warranty by Fox, but it's still a bummer to experience those failures on what is otherwise nearly an $8,000 bike. I also had a problem with the rear wheel losing spoke tension, which is generally a sign of a poor factory build. Now, Bicycles Online, the Australian distributor for Polygon, explained that if a customer had the same issue that we did, they could take the wheel into their local bike shop and have it repaired, and Bicycles Online would reimburse that customer for the cost of the repair, which seems totally reasonable. The only other issue I experienced on our test bike was some occasional heel rub on the seat stays. Now, the seat stay tubes are quite straight on this bike, so depending on your shoe size and your gait, you might have a little bit of contact there. With that in mind, I'd recommend fitting some thick protective tape in that area. Also, for those who regularly ride in wet conditions, you'll want to keep an eye on the lower linkage, which does create something of a mud shelf. The way it angles down into the frame pocket also means it'll direct filth further inwards towards the pivot. With this in mind, it'd be really nice to see Polygon develop some kind of mud guard specifically for this area of the frame. That said, we've not had any issues at all with any of the pivots on our test bike, which is a good thing because there are 9 of them and 16 bearings in total. But while it is more complex than a traditional 4-bar platform, it's worth noting that there are no proprietary components to the suspension design, and there are no special tools required to pull it apart in service. Still, I do dread the day when one of the bearings does start to creak and you have to go through 16 of them to find out which one is the culprit. And that, my friends, brings us to the verdict of the new Polygon Mt Bromo. As expected, Polygon has delivered one heck of a package for the money with its first proper e-mountain bike. The frame is solid, the geometry is totally up to date, and there's a ton of traction thanks to the smooth suspension and grippy tyres. It's plenty capable on rough terrain, but it's really the short rear end on this bike which helps to boost its versatility and fun factor on machine-built flow trails. The small battery and the lack of a water bottle mount may make it a non-starter for some, but for those who are less concerned by all-day range and are after a fun and involving e-mountain bike to session laps at the bike park or the local trail centre, there's no doubt that the Mt Bromo gets you a whole lot of bike for the cash. Now, if you'd like to read the full review of the Polygon Mt Bromo, make sure you go to flowmountainbike.com, click the link in the video description below and that will take you right there. Be sure to give us a thumbs up if you enjoyed the video and make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel because I know you guys will not want to miss out on the video reviews of the bikes that we're currently testing. Otherwise, that's it from me guys. I hope you enjoyed this video and we'll see you next time. Tooroo!